In 2008, a young couple vanished while hiking deep in Yellowstone's backcountry without leaving a trace. Now, 12 years later, rangers uncover their wrecked tent buried beneath ash, and the chilling evidence inside reveals the haunting truth of what really happened on their final night in the wilderness. The summer of 2008 had drawn record numbers of visitors to Yellowstone, each of them chasing the promise of wild beauty and untouched wilderness. Among them were Emily and Josh Turner, a young couple from Colorado who had packed their car with camping gear, trail maps, and the kind of optimism that came easily to those who felt most at home beneath open skies. They had been married less than 2 years, still weaving their traditions together, and this trip was meant to be one of those traditions, a way to mark the seasons by immersing themselves in the wild. Their last confirmed sighting came at a general store near the park's entrance, where they picked up snacks, a trail permit, and batteries for their small digital camera. The clerk remembered their laughter, how Emily leaned over the counter to ask about the best backcountry trails away from the crowds. Josh had carried a bright red hiking jacket tied around his waist, while Emily wore her turquoise fleece, the color vivid against her sun-warmed skin. They left the store, drove toward the trailhead, and were never seen again. When their car was found days later, locked and neatly parked, the alarm bells rang. Rangers traced their hiking permit to a section of trail near the Shoshone Geyser Basin, an area known for both its striking beauty and its unpredictability. Search crews combed the terrain, helicopters scanned the tree lines, and volunteers trekked miles of backcountry. Dogs picked up a scent that disappeared near a river crossing, fueling speculation that the couple had been swept downstream. Others whispered of grizzlies and wolves, the silent predators of the park. Weeks passed with no answers. The only clues were a few scuffed tracks on a dirt trail that led nowhere certain. By autumn, the search was scaled back, leaving only family and a handful of determined rangers clinging to the hope that one day something would surface. Emily's sister Claire spoke at vigils, her voice breaking as she described the couple's love of adventure and how she refused to believe that such a love could simply vanish without a trace. For 12 years, Yellowstone held its silence, the story of Emily and Josh becoming part of its shadowed lore. It would take fire and ash and the brutal reshaping of the land to finally break that silence. The Turners' disappearance lingered like a half-remembered nightmare in the Yellowstone community. At first, the park buzzed with their story, visitors whispering about the young couple who had stepped into the forest and never returned. Flyers with their smiling faces were taped to lodge bulletin boards and ranger stations, Emily's turquoise fleece and Josh's red jacket standing out even in black and white copies. Their families visited the park repeatedly, retracing the paths the couple might have taken, staring out across steaming geyser basins and endless meadows that gave no answers. For a time, the nation followed along, the Turners' photographs appearing on news broadcasts, their story another mystery added to the long list of vanishings that haunted the vast wilderness. But as the seasons changed and no new evidence surfaced, the search effort slowed. The park could not remain closed to tourists forever, and the rangers, though unwilling, had to declare the official search concluded. Emily and Josh's names were added quietly to a database of missing persons, while their families were left with a void where certainty should have been. Claire, Emily's sister, refused to let the case be forgotten. She organized candlelight vigils in their hometown, spoke to newspapers when interest waned, and kept a box of letters she had written to her sister over the years, each one a desperate attempt to bridge the silence. As time passed, their story faded from public memory. Other news took its place, and Yellowstone carried on with its endless cycles of fire and growth. Visitors walked the same trails the Turners had once set foot on, unaware of the tragedy hidden beneath the pines. Yet for Claire, and for a handful of rangers who had been part of the original search, the absence of answers remained like a stone in the chest. Every year when summer came, she thought of Emily lacing her boots, smiling for a camera, unaware that she was about to step into history as a question no one could answer. By 2020, 12 long years later, the case had gone cold. No new tips, no belongings stumbled upon by chance, no chance hiker spotting a clue. The wilderness had swallowed Emily and Josh whole, and it seemed determined to keep them. What no one could know was that Yellowstone, with all its power to bury and preserve, had kept their story waiting, sealed under a layer of ash that would not stay hidden forever. The summer of 2020 brought with it a season of fire. Lightning storms rolled across Yellowstone in late July, igniting dry timber and brush that had been building for years. Flames swept through ridges and valleys, consuming everything in their path, leaving behind a landscape of blackened trunks and drifting ash. For weeks, the sky carried a haze that turned sunsets blood red and mornings gray, and the park closed large sections of backcountry as firefighters worked desperately to contain the spread. When the last embers cooled and the smoke finally lifted, Yellowstone looked altered, as if stripped bare to reveal its bones. In the aftermath, teams of rangers were sent out to assess the damage. Their work was painstaking, each group assigned to document ecological impact, repair trails, and mark unstable ground. It was dangerous, but necessary work, as fire reshaped the park in ways tourists would never see. In one remote stretch near Shoshone Lake, the land had been transformed into a wasteland of gray soil and charred remains, the once dense canopy gone. It was here, in the silence of scorched wilderness, that something unexpected broke the monotony of ash and ruin. A ranger named Paul Hansen was the first to notice it. He had been scanning the ground near a collapsed tree when he spotted a faint splash of color where there should have been none. At first, he thought it was litter carried by the wind, maybe a hiker's lost gear exposed by the fire, but as he brushed away a layer of soot, his gloved hand struck fabric. It was dirty, shredded, and buried deep, but unmistakably synthetic. More digging revealed the bent top of an aluminum pole, the kind used for backpacking tents. Paul called over his team, and together they began to carefully clear the ash away. Slowly, the shape emerged, a tent crushed flat under years of weight, its fabric discolored but still recognizable. The fire had not destroyed it, only revealed what had long been hidden. Scattered around it were fragments of gear, warped by heat but not consumed. The discovery left the rangers silent, each of them understanding what it might mean. After 12 years, Yellowstone had given up a secret, and for the first time since 2008, there was reason to believe that the fate of Emily and Josh Turner was buried here, waiting to be told. The rangers knelt in silence around the wreckage, the air still heavy with the scent of charred wood and damp ash. What lay before them was not the usual aftermath of wildfire. The tent had not been burned away by the flames that swept the park weeks earlier. Instead, it looked as though it had been buried long before, entombed beneath layers of volcanic ash and soil that the fire had scoured away. Its red fabric, though torn and weathered, clung stubbornly to the collapsed frame, a muted echo of the vibrant shelter it had once been. They worked carefully, brushing the soil back with gloved hands and trowels, marking each fragment they uncovered. A rusted cooking pan appeared first. Its handle snapped clean, then the remains of a nylon sleeping bag fused with dirt and time. One ranger retrieved what looked like the warped frame of a small digital camera, its buttons melted, the screen spidered with cracks. Nearby, the edge of a notebook poked through the ash, its pages stiff and watermarked but intact enough to hint at handwriting inside. Paul Hansen radioed the discovery to headquarters, his voice measured but tight. He had been in the park long enough to know the lore that surrounded missing hikers, and though he avoided words like Turner's or 2008 on the airwaves, the thought hung over the crew like a shadow. When the site was secure, photographs were taken, and the evidence was logged. The tent's collapsed entrance was still half buried, requiring more excavation, but already the picture was clear. This was not a campsite abandoned by choice. That night, Paul sat by the ranger station window, the notebook sealed in an evidence bag beside him. He hadn't opened it, but the sight of it alone left him unsettled. Someone had once written inside that journal, carrying their voice into the wilderness. If it belonged to Emily or Josh, then their words might have survived even when they did not. For the first time in over a decade, the mystery that had haunted Yellowstone no longer felt like a legend passed around campfires. It was real, tangible, and sitting under the fluorescent lights of a ranger's desk. The park, in its brutal way, had finally given something back. Word of the discovery spread quickly through the ranger network, reaching offices beyond Yellowstone's borders. By morning, the site had been taped off and guarded, a quiet stretch of forest now treated as a scene of history and loss. Specialists arrived with evidence kits, their boots sinking into the soft ash as they moved with deliberate care. What had once been overlooked ground now demanded answers. The excavation revealed more with each careful sweep. A second sleeping bag, shredded but still distinguishable, was pulled from beneath the collapsed frame of the tent. Next came a set of utensils, their metal handles blackened but not destroyed. Then, tucked under the far corner, a fragment of clothing appeared. It was turquoise in color, faded but stubbornly vibrant against the gray ash, and those who knew the story of the Turners felt their breath catch. Emily had been wearing a turquoise fleece jacket the day she vanished. Forensic staff photographed the fabric, sealed it in plastic, and noted its position relative to the other items. There was no room for speculation in their work, yet every ranger standing at the perimeter exchanged glances. The coincidence was too striking to ignore. When the soil around the tent's entrance was finally cleared, they discovered something else: shoe prints, preserved in hardened ash, not recent but fossilized in place like silent witnesses to a moment long past. The impressions were small, human, and led in uneven lines away from the site before vanishing into the charred earth. They could not say whose steps they were, but the presence of those prints turned the site from a collapsed tent into a fragment of a story, frozen in time. Back at headquarters, the recovered notebook sat under controlled drying conditions, technicians carefully separating each stiffened page. Faint ink bled through, words that would take time to reconstruct, but even the promise of written entries carried weight. If it was the Turners' journal, then their final days in Yellowstone were not entirely lost. As night fell, the rangers left the site under guard. The forest, stripped bare and silent, seemed to press in closer than usual. Somewhere beneath its ash and stone, Emily and Josh's voices had been preserved, waiting 12 long years for someone to find them. Now the wilderness had whispered, and it was up to the living to listen. The following morning, a mist clung low over the burned-out valley, the kind of haze that softened every edge and made the land feel older than it was. The excavation team returned to the site at first light, their breath clouding in the chilled air as they continued unearthing the collapsed tent. Ash gave way reluctantly, releasing objects that had not seen sunlight in more than a decade. From the soil near the tent's rear corner, a ranger uncovered the shattered remains of a small digital camera. Its casing was warped, buttons frozen in place, but the memory card was still lodged inside. The technicians sealed it quickly, noting that modern forensics might still coax its contents back to life. The idea that photographs could have survived sent a ripple of unease through the team. If images remained, they would show more than the forest had ever revealed. Moments from the couple's final days, frozen in pixels rather than silence. More fragments of clothing emerged next, each one dulled by years underground. A torn sleeve, a strip of red nylon that could have been part of Josh's jacket, scraps of polyester from a backpack strap. Nothing was whole, yet each fragment confirmed what had long been feared. This was not a campsite abandoned in haste, but one buried by the unforgiving earth, sealed beneath ash as though the land itself had chosen to keep its secret. By afternoon, the excavation paused as evidence was logged and secured. Rangers stood in a loose circle, their faces solemn as the weight of discovery pressed in on them. Yellowstone was a place of awe and beauty, but also of danger, and this site was a reminder of its indifference. Here, among geothermal vents and shifting ground, the Turners' final story had played out unseen. At the station later that day, the notebook had begun to yield its first legible lines under careful preservation. The ink bled and faded, but the words were clear enough to recognize. They spoke of long trails, of sore feet, and of the sound of distant thunder. The voice was alive, hopeful, and still unaware of the darkness waiting ahead. Reading it, one ranger whispered what everyone felt, that Emily and Josh were no longer faceless names on a missing persons list. They had been here, they had written, and now, at last, they were speaking again. The journal pages, once carefully separated and placed under a light to dry, revealed their first true entry that tied the Turners to the doomed campsite. The handwriting was uneven, smudged by moisture, but unmistakably human, carrying the cadence of someone who believed they still had control of their fate. Emily had written about how they had strayed from the marked trail after spotting what she described as a clearing that looked untouched, a place no one had walked before. Her words painted a picture of excitement rather than fear, the kind of curiosity that had always driven the couple to take detours and trust their instincts. Another page described a restless night. She noted sulfur in the air, the faint tremor of the ground beneath their tent, and a heat that seemed to rise from the soil itself. Josh, she wrote, had dismissed it as their nerves, insisting they were simply camping near one of Yellowstone's countless geothermal vents. Emily's words, though, betrayed unease. She wondered if they had pitched their tent in a place the earth itself wanted to reclaim. The rangers who read the entry exchanged glances, understanding the cruel accuracy of her words. The tent had not been consumed by wildfire, but buried under ash from a sudden geothermal eruption, an event violent enough to smother everything in its path. It was rare, but not unheard of, and if the Turners had been caught unaware, their fate might have been sealed in minutes. Outside, the autumn wind cut across the ranger station, rattling windows and carrying the smell of burned pine. Paul Hansen stood at the edge of the desk, staring at the journal with a heaviness in his chest. For years their names had been spoken with uncertainty, maybe lost, maybe attacked, maybe gone by choice, but the handwriting on those fragile pages told a different story. Emily and Josh had not vanished into legend. They had been here, alive, recording their wonder and their fears until the wilderness silenced them. As more pages were examined, the rangers braced themselves. What they held was not just evidence. It was a voice pulled from the ash, one that would carry them closer to the couple's final night and the truth that had been hidden for 12 long years. The following entry in the notebook was dated 2 days after the first, though the ink had bled enough to make the numbers uncertain. Emily's words described how they had attempted to retrace their steps back toward the trailhead, only to find that shifting ground and a haze of ash in the air had left them disoriented. She wrote of their growing unease, of how each ridge looked the same as the last, and how the silence of the backcountry pressed harder with each passing hour. Josh had tried to reassure her, marking trees with stones and fallen branches, but she admitted that every landmark felt unsteady, as if the landscape itself was changing around them. In the margin, almost as an afterthought, Emily had scribbled about an argument. She wanted to set up camp closer to the river they had passed earlier, believing water meant safety. Josh insisted on pressing forward, certain they were close to intersecting another marked trail. The words ended abruptly, the line cut off mid-sentence as if she had been interrupted. When the notebook was set down on the ranger's desk, the room grew quiet. Each line made the Turners' ordeal more vivid, peeling away the mystery to reveal fear and exhaustion in its place. For the first time, their final days felt less like speculation and more like testimony. Meanwhile, the digital camera retrieved from the ash was sent to a laboratory in Bozeman. Specialists delicately extracted the memory card, uncertain if it had survived years underground. Against all odds, the card powered on, its contents still intact. Dozens of photographs filled the screen, smiling selfies at the trailhead, shots of steaming basins, Emily framed against a backdrop of geysers, Josh crouched by a riverbank tying his boot. But as the sequence moved forward, the mood shifted. The later images showed dust hanging in the air, a tent coated in gray particles, and finally, a blurry shot of Emily's face lit only by the beam of a headlamp, her expression tired, her smile forced. The last file ended abruptly, its timestamp late at night. Beyond it, nothing but silence. The Rangers sat with the knowledge that they were now looking at the Turners' final images, fragments of a journey that had begun with laughter and ended in ash. The wilderness had not erased everything. It had left behind echoes, and those echoes were finally speaking. The lab technicians continued to sift through the camera's recovered files, piecing together the Turners' last recorded movements. The sequence of photographs revealed a steady decline from the buoyant optimism of their first days to the grim determination of their final hours. One set of images caught the Rangers' attention more than the rest. They showed a patch of ground split open in jagged lines, steam rising faintly from the cracks, the soil around it coated in pale ash. In one frame, Josh had crouched beside the fissure, his hand raised as if testing the heat, while Emily stood back, her body angled as though she wanted to leave. The photograph after that was different. It showed only darkness, punctuated by drifting flecks of ash caught in the beam of a flashlight. The framing was tilted, the image blurred by movement, but the sense of panic was unmistakable. Whoever had taken the picture had been running. Alongside the photos, the notebook provided fragments that mirrored the images. Emily had written of the ground breathing beneath them, of sudden heat that made the air shimmer. She described coughing fits, the smell of sulfur, and the unnerving sense that the earth could shift at any moment. One line, scrawled hastily, read, "Josh says it's nothing, but it feels like we're standing on something alive." The combination of evidence painted a picture too vivid to ignore. The tent had not been destroyed by wildfire, nor simply abandoned in the wilderness. It had been buried by a geothermal event, one of Yellowstone's unpredictable bursts of heat and ash. Such events were rare and localized, but powerful enough to smother everything in their path. Back at the ranger station, the team laid out the photographs, journal excerpts, and recovered artifacts in careful sequence. It was as if Emily and Josh were speaking across the years, guiding them step by step toward the truth of what had happened. The mystery that had hung over Yellowstone for 12 years was beginning to take shape, not as a story of predators or foul play, but as a testament to the raw, unforgiving force of the land itself. For those who read the words and studied the images, one truth was inescapable. The Turners had not simply vanished, they had been claimed by the wilderness, and only now was the wilderness giving them back. News of the discovery began to spread beyond the ranger station, carried first through official channels and then into the world of journalists and online forums. By the time the story reached Emily's sister, Claire, it had already been condensed into a single sentence. After 12 years, the Turners' tent had been found. The phone call from the Park Service came hours later, but even before she answered, Claire knew. Her knees weakened as she listened to the ranger's careful words, her hand trembling around the receiver. For years she had prayed for answers, and now the answers had come in a form she both longed for and dreaded. She agreed to travel to Yellowstone immediately. The park arranged for her to meet the investigators, not at the site itself, which was still sealed, but at the station where the evidence had been cataloged. Claire drove from Colorado through stretches of highway she remembered from the summer of 2008 when she had first come searching for her sister. Every turn of the road seemed to echo with memory, each mile bringing her closer not to hope but to closure. At the ranger station, she was led into a quiet room where the recovered belongings were laid out. The notebook was kept under glass, the camera sealed in an evidence bag, the fragments of clothing arranged in careful order. Her eyes locked on the turquoise scrap, dulled but still carrying the color she knew so well. She pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting to hold back tears. "That was Emily's," she whispered, the words barely audible. The Rangers explained what they had pieced together so far, showing her copies of the journal entries, some of them faint but still readable. Hearing her sister's voice in ink after all those years broke something inside her. The lines about sore feet and the joy of discovering hidden clearings were exactly how Emily had always been. But then came the words about ash, sulfur, and the earth rumbling underfoot. Claire listened without interruption, her gaze fixed on the fragile pages. When they finished, she finally spoke, her voice steady despite the tears. At least now I know she was herself until the end. She was writing. She was still fighting. For the first time in 12 years, the silence that had haunted her family was beginning to lift. Claire remained at the station long after the rangers had finished their explanations. She sat quietly in the dim light, staring at the fragments of her sister's life laid out before her. The turquoise fabric, the warped camera, the stiffened pages of the journal, each one carried the weight of years she had spent imagining countless endings. Now, finally, those years of unanswered questions were collapsing into something real, something she could touch. That evening, one of the rangers, Paul Hansen, offered to walk her through the photographs recovered from the memory card. He warned her they were not all easy to look at, but Claire nodded, needing to see everything. The first images brought a brief, bittersweet smile. There was Emily, her cheeks flushed from hiking, grinning beside Josh at the edge of a geyser basin. There was another of the two of them by the river, Emily's turquoise fleece, vivid against the water's shimmer. They looked happy, alive, untouched by what was to come. As the photographs progressed, the tone shifted, the forest grew darker, their faces wearier. Shots of their tent coated in dust appeared, followed by strange, blurry frames, streaked with gray particles. Then came the flashlight image. Emily's forced smile caught in the narrow beam, the weariness in her eyes impossible to ignore. Claire pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the ache that came with knowing these were her sister's final images, fragments of a journey she could never change. Paul closed the laptop gently and gave her a moment. "We don't have the whole story yet," he said softly, "but what we do have proves they never gave up. They fought to keep going, even when the wilderness turned against them." Later, when she stepped outside, the night air was cold and sharp. The stars spread wide over the park her sister had loved so much. Claire wrapped her arms around herself and let the silence settle. For years, she had feared Emily had been swallowed whole, erased without a trace. But here, under Yellowstone's vast sky, she understood something different. Her sister's story had not been lost. It had endured, buried under ash, waiting for the right moment to be found. The next morning, Claire accompanied Paul and a small team of rangers to the perimeter of the discovery site. She was not permitted beyond the taped boundary, but even standing at a distance, the sight of the scarred earth and the charred trees pressed heavily against her chest. The ground was gray and brittle, the landscape stripped of its color, as though time itself had conspired to erase the memory of what had happened there. Yet in that desolation, the remnants of the tent had been exposed, pulled back into the light after 12 silent years. She stood quietly, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, imagining Emily and Josh setting up camp in that very spot. She pictured the turquoise fleece hung on a branch to dry, Josh fiddling with the camera as he always did, Emily laughing at something small and silly. The image clashed painfully with the broken canvas that now lay half-buried, torn by ash and weather. The two realities pressed against each other, the joy of a couple in love and the silence of their final resting place. Paul explained how rare geothermal events of this kind were, how sudden bursts of ash and heat could smother the land within minutes. He spoke gently, careful with each word, but Claire hardly needed the explanation. The journal had already given her sister's voice, describing the sulfur, the trembling ground, the way the earth seemed alive beneath them. The site itself was only confirmation, a brutal punctuation mark to the story already etched into faded ink. Before they left, Claire asked to approach closer. She walked slowly to the edge of the cordon, kneeling in the ash, her fingers brushing the powdery soil. She did not reach for the wreckage, but she whispered something only the wind could hear, a farewell she had been carrying for 12 years. Her tears fell quietly, sinking into the ground as if returning to the place where her sister had been lost. When she rose, the ranger team prepared to resume their work, documenting and collecting what remained. Claire turned back once more before leaving, the broken tent and the blackened trees etched into her memory. The wilderness had kept its secret for over a decade, but now, in its own unforgiving way, it had delivered the truth. Forensic teams continued their work at the site over the following days, cataloging every scrap that could still be recovered from the ash. Each item was lifted carefully, photographed in place, and sealed away in evidence bags, as if they were fragments of a fragile story written long ago. Among the broken utensils and fabric, one ranger uncovered a charred metal watch, its glass face fractured but still clinging to the faint outline of hands frozen in place. The time read just past midnight. No one could say whether the watch had stopped on the Turners' final night or years later as corrosion set in, but its presence deepened the weight of the discovery. The most haunting find came from beneath a hardened layer of ash near what had once been the tent's entrance. There, barely intact, lay the remnants of 2 hiking boots, their leather stiffened and cracked, the soles worn with the pattern of countless miles. One still bore laces tied in a double knot, frayed but intact. The boots were bagged without comment, though every ranger present knew what they represented. At the ranger station, Claire was shown photographs of the items as they were recovered. Her breath caught when she saw the watch, recognizing it immediately as Josh's. She had teased him once for wearing it even on vacations, refusing to leave behind the bulky piece of gear he insisted was practical. The sight of it now, broken and blackened, brought her grief crashing back in a way the other items had not. It was proof, undeniable and merciless, that Josh had been there with her sister until the end. Meanwhile, the journal's later pages were gradually being restored. Each fragment told of mounting exhaustion and confusion, of how the ash in the air made it difficult to breathe, of how Emily worried they were circling the same landmarks without realizing it. There was no sense of panic in her words, only an unyielding effort to keep moving forward. Reading them, Claire realized that her sister's determination had never wavered, even as the wilderness closed in around them. The combination of artifacts and words began to form a picture, not of mystery but of struggle, of 2 people fighting to endure against forces too great to overcome. It was both devastating and strangely comforting. After 12 years of silence, their final days were no longer an empty question. They were a story, fragile but preserved, finally coming to light. The analysis of the camera's final photographs continued to unspool the Turners' last days like a series of fading memories. Technicians enhanced the grainy images, sharpening details hidden by years of degradation. One of the most striking pictures showed the couple sitting together at the entrance of their tent, their faces illuminated by a headlamp. Josh's arm was draped protectively around Emily's shoulders, while she leaned into him with a tired half-smile. The background was eerie, a haze of drifting ash swirling in the beam of light like falling snow. It was the last clear image of them together, captured not as a posed memory, but as a moment of weary intimacy in the middle of fear. Alongside the photographs, fragments of the journal revealed more of Emily's voice. She wrote about the persistent rumbling in the ground, how it seemed to come and go without warning, how it made her dream at night of the earth breaking open beneath them. Josh, ever the steady one, had tried to turn her fears into jokes, comparing the tremors to the rumble of a passing train. She noted his humor, but beneath her words lay a current of unease, a recognition that they were not merely lost hikers, but witnesses to something larger and more dangerous. For investigators, the evidence pointed to a rare but plausible explanation. A sudden geothermal release, one of the park's unpredictable exhalations of heat and ash. The Turners had pitched their tent in the wrong place at the wrong time, and when the eruption came, it buried their camp under layers of debris in minutes. Fire had not consumed them. The earth itself had swallowed them whole. Claire listened to these findings with quiet composure, her eyes fixed on the images spread across the table. She traced the outline of her sister's face in the photograph with her fingertip, lingering on the faint smile that seemed so achingly familiar. For years, she had imagined every possible ending, from animal attacks to human violence, and each one had left her restless. But this strange, natural catastrophe carried with it a solemn kind of peace. Her sister and Josh had not vanished because of cruelty or malice. They had been overtaken by the wilderness they so loved, caught in a moment of Yellowstone's timeless, indifferent power. It was an ending Claire could mourn, but also, in some way, begin to accept. The recovery team's work entered a new phase when soil samples from around the tent were sent to a laboratory for deeper analysis. The results confirmed what the investigators had already suspected. The Turners' camp had been buried in a sudden geothermal ashfall, a localized eruption that left no record in official monitoring logs. Such events were rare, often unnoticed by tourists or even staff, yet powerful enough to suffocate anything in their path. The ash layer that entombed the tent had hardened like cement over the years, preserving what lay beneath while hiding it from sight until the wildfire stripped the land bare. Among the items cataloged that week was a warped metal flask. Inside, despite years underground, a trace of liquid remained. Testing confirmed it was water mixed with faint traces of ash. It told investigators that the couple had tried to hold on, rationing what they had in a desperate effort to endure. More fragments of personal belongings emerged as well: a hair clip bent but still intact, a pair of cracked sunglasses, a torn map whose creases suggested it had been folded and refolded many times. Each item was ordinary, but in the context of where it was found, each spoke volumes about their struggle. At the ranger station, Claire was given access to some of these artifacts. She turned the hair clip over in her hand, recognizing it immediately as Emily's, a simple plastic piece she had worn on countless hikes. The sight of it undid her more than anything else she had seen. Notebooks and photographs could tell a story, but the hair clip was intimate, a part of her sister's daily life that had endured the weight of years and ash. She held it against her palm, the plastic cold, and whispered, "She really was here, she really fought to the end." The rangers gave her time alone with the objects, understanding the gravity of such a moment. Outside, the forest remained eerily silent, stripped by fire and wind, but inside the small evidence room, the silence was heavier still. For Claire, 12 years of not knowing had hardened into grief. Yet, as she sat with her sister's belongings spread before her, she felt something shift. The wilderness had not erased Emily. It had preserved fragments of her, small and fragile, but enough to bring her voice back into the world. The journal continued to yield fragments of Emily's words, pieced together page by page as conservationists carefully treated the delicate sheets. The later entries carried a weight that was absent in the beginning, the sentences shorter, the handwriting rushed. She wrote of exhaustion setting in, of nights where the air felt thick and unbreathable, of ash settling on their skin no matter how often they brushed it away. She described Josh's determination to keep her calm, how he tried to joke about them being explorers on another planet, their tent a small outpost in an alien land. The humor was tender, but beneath it lay desperation, a recognition that their world had narrowed to survival alone. One line, faint and half erased by moisture, caught the team's attention. Emily had written, "The ground shook again. Josh says we should move, but I can't breathe when we walk. We'll wait until morning." The words trailed off, the ink bleeding into the paper's fibers. It was likely one of the last things she ever wrote. At the same time, the recovered map was examined under better light. Though torn and water-stained, faint marks showed where Josh had tried to chart their movements. Circles and arrows suggested they had been attempting to navigate back toward the river, but the marks looped back on themselves. To the investigators, it was a heartbreaking detail. The couple had been walking in circles, trapped in a landscape that betrayed them at every turn. Claire read the entries with trembling hands. Each word pulled her closer to her sister's final hours, as though Emily were speaking across time. She could picture her writing by lantern light, pressing the pen harder as the pages stiffened with ash, forcing herself to record even when there was nothing left but fatigue and fear. For years, Claire had lived with silence, with the void of not knowing. Now she found herself holding fragments of a farewell, words not written to her, but reaching her nonetheless. In them, she saw Emily's strength, her stubbornness, her refusal to let despair swallow her whole. It was not the ending Claire had ever imagined, but it was a voice she had thought she had lost forever. And for the first time in 12 years, that voice was answering back. For days, investigators continued to sift through the site, unearthing layer after layer of ash until the outline of the campsite was fully revealed. The tent, flattened and warped, had acted like a vault, trapping fragments of the couple's life within its collapsed frame. Nearby, rangers uncovered the remains of a small campfire pit, its stones scattered and blackened, with charred wood still preserved inside. The discovery suggested Emily and Josh had attempted to hold onto routine, building a fire even as the ash thickened and the air turned heavy. What struck the team most was how ordinary the camp looked despite the tragedy. Cooking gear lay where it had fallen, a spoon still resting inside a warped tin cup, as though it had been set down mid-meal. A rolled bandana was tucked under a rock, the kind of small improvisation hikers use to keep fabric from blowing away. Even in their last moments, the Turners had not abandoned order. They had tried to carry on, fighting to maintain a sense of normalcy in a place that had become unrecognizable. Forensic examination of the soil revealed layers of fine ash and mineral deposits consistent with a localized geothermal event. Geologists explained that such bursts could blanket an area with suffocating debris in minutes, leaving anyone caught within it little chance of escape. The evidence now pointed firmly to this explanation. No sign of an animal attack, no evidence of foul play, just the raw, unpredictable force of Yellowstone itself. Claire listened to the findings in a haze, her grief sharpened by the vivid details. She imagined her sister crouched by the fire, brushing ash from her eyes, refusing to give in even as the land itself turned hostile. It was painful, but it was also deeply familiar. That was Emily, resilient, stubborn, clinging to hope even when logic said otherwise. That night, Claire sat outside the ranger station, the journal resting on her lap. She read the last clear entry again, tracing each word with her fingertip. The stars stretched across the Yellowstone sky above her, vast and indifferent. Yet, in the quiet, she felt her sister close, not lost in the wilderness, but preserved within it, her story written in ash and silence until someone was ready to hear it. For the first time, closure no longer felt like an ending, but a way to carry Emily forward. The discovery of the campsite changed everything for the small team of rangers and forensic experts who had worked the case quietly for years. What had once been a story passed around in hushed tones, two hikers swallowed by the vastness of Yellowstone, was now anchored by real evidence, tangible proof of what had happened. With each item logged and each soil sample tested, the silence of 12 years grew louder, replaced by fragments of a narrative that was slowly taking shape. Among the final items recovered was a plastic food container, cracked but still sealed shut. Inside, beneath dust and debris, were energy bars wrapped in faded foil. They had packed for survival, prepared with care, but the earth had given them no chance. To investigators, the container spoke of intent, of planning, of two people who did everything right only to find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong moment. The more the evidence was cataloged, the clearer it became that the Turners' fate was not born of recklessness, but of Yellowstone's indifference. They had followed trails, packed supplies, carried maps, and still the wilderness had claimed them. That realization weighed heavily on everyone involved. For families, closure often came through blame, something to point to, a mistake that explained the loss. Here, the truth was harsher. There was no single error to condemn, only the reminder that nature itself could be merciless. Claire walked with Paul Hansen back to the boundary of the excavation, where the cordon tape flapped faintly in the mountain wind. From where she stood, the ground looked scarred and bare, but she knew that beneath it her sister had lived her final days. She asked softly if it would remain marked, if the site would be forgotten once the investigation closed. Paul assured her that the coordinates would stay recorded, and though the land would heal, the story would not disappear. As the sun sank, Claire lingered at the edge of the clearing, her eyes tracing the ridges in the distance. For 12 years, She had lived in the shadow of uncertainty, carrying the weight of what she did not know. Now, at last, she felt both the depth of her loss and the strange relief of truth. Yellowstone had not erased Emily and Josh. It had held them in silence, waiting for the fire and ash to reveal them once more. The forensic team's final sweep of the site yielded what many had quietly anticipated but dreaded to confront. Just beyond the collapsed tent, under a hardened layer of ash and soil, fragments of human remains were uncovered. They were fragile, incomplete, and worn by time, but there was no mistaking their origin. With deliberate care, each piece was lifted and preserved, the ground around them documented in meticulous detail. The silence among the rangers as they worked was absolute, the kind that comes when a place shifts from mystery to certainty. At the station, Claire was told gently of the discovery. She sat very still as the words sank in, her hands folded tightly in her lap. For years she had imagined her sister wandering, lost but alive, or perhaps taken by something darker. To hear now that Emily and Josh had indeed been here, buried beneath the same ground where their belongings were found, was both devastating and strangely consoling. The uncertainty had ended. The wilderness had confirmed what her heart had long feared. The remains were sent for DNA analysis, though the rangers already knew the results would match. Alongside the testing, the recovered artifacts, the watch, the clothing scraps, the journal, and the camera were assembled into a timeline. Each piece filled a gap in the story, leading from laughter at the trailhead to the suffocating ashfall that sealed their fate. It was not a tale of recklessness or neglect, but of nature's unpredictable violence, a reminder that Yellowstone was as perilous as it was beautiful. That evening, Claire was allowed to sit alone with some of the belongings. She placed the journal before her, her fingertips resting on the warped cover. She did not open it. She had read the words before. Instead, she let the weight of it settle, as if touching the pages could bridge the 12 years that had stretched like an endless canyon between them. The turquoise fabric lay beside it, a whisper of her sister's presence, and Claire bowed her head, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Outside, the park stretched on, vast and untamed, its valleys already beginning to heal from fire. But here, in this small room filled with ash-stained artifacts, the truth of Emily and Josh Turner had finally been returned from silence. The wilderness had claimed them, but it had not kept them forever. The confirmation from the lab arrived within a week. DNA taken from the fragile remains matched both Emily and Josh Turner. The call came to Claire on a gray morning, her voice breaking as the ranger on the other end spoke the words she had known were coming. The waiting was over. Her sister and brother-in-law had been found. For 12 years she had carried the hollow ache of uncertainty, a wound reopened every time a new lead proved empty. Now at last there was no more room for speculation. The wilderness had given her the truth, harsh and undeniable. At the ranger station, the team gathered around a table scattered with photographs and artifacts, the timeline of the Turners' journey carefully laid out. The smiling images from the camera, the journal entries filled with quiet hope and growing fear, the scattered fragments of gear, and finally, the remains, all of it told a complete story. It was not the ending anyone wanted, but it was an ending nonetheless. One ranger remarked softly that the couple's resilience was remarkable, that even in the journal's final entries Emily had not written of despair, only of pushing forward. That determination lingered with everyone who read her words. When Claire arrived to sign the final documents releasing the remains to her family, she moved with a quiet grace, though grief weighed heavily on her. The rangers treated her not just as a relative, but as part of the investigation itself, a person who had carried the case forward when others had let it fade. They gave her space in the evidence room, where the items were displayed one last time before being sealed away. She traced her hand over the glass covering the turquoise fleece fragment and whispered, "You didn't disappear, Em. You were here all along." That evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, Claire stood with Paul Hansen on the edge of the ash-cleared valley. The land was silent, stripped bare by fire and time, but it felt almost reverent. Claire closed her eyes and let the cold air wash over her. The pain of loss had not lessened, but the burden of not knowing had lifted. In its place was something fragile but necessary. At last, she could begin to mourn, not the mystery, but the memory. Claire stayed in Yellowstone for several more days after the confirmation, reluctant to leave the place that had taken so much from her but finally offered her answers. Each morning she walked along the trails near the ranger station, bundled against the chill, her steps slow and deliberate. She wanted to feel the land under her feet the way her sister had, to take in the wide valleys and steaming vents and know what Emily must have seen in her final days. The beauty of it all was undeniable, but threaded through every vista was an edge of sorrow, a reminder that this same wilderness had buried her sister for 12 long years. The rangers kept her updated as the last of the excavation was completed. Nothing new of significance was found, only smaller fragments of gear and scattered debris, yet Claire requested to see each one. A bent fork, a zipper from a backpack. The smallest details carried weight, like echoes of a life cut short. She kept thinking how ordinary they all were, the kinds of items any hiker might carry, and yet in this context they became sacred. In the evenings she joined Paul Hansen in the ranger office where they reviewed the photographs recovered from the camera. She asked him to replay them in sequence, one after another, from the carefree smiles at the trailhead to the final grainy images lit by flashlight. Each time, she found herself pausing at the same picture, the one where Emily leaned against Josh outside the tent, ash drifting in the air like ghostly snow. That image, more than any other, felt like the moment where hope and despair touched shoulders. On her last night, Claire stood outside beneath the wide sprawl of stars. The land was quiet, the forest still recovering from fire, the scent of charred wood lingering in the cold. She whispered a promise into the darkness, a vow to carry her sister's story home, to make sure it was remembered not as a mystery, but as the testament of two people who loved the wilderness and were caught in its merciless power. For the first time in 12 years, she was leaving Yellowstone not with questions, but with answers. It was not peace, not yet, but it was the beginning of it. Claire returned home to Colorado, carrying a small box of belongings that the rangers had released to her. Inside were the fragments deemed personal enough to return, the turquoise fleece scrap, the hair clip, and the warped metal watch that had once belonged to Josh. The rest would remain sealed in evidence storage, preserved as part of the official record. She placed the box on her dining room table and sat before it for a long time, staring at the objects as if they might speak. In their silence, they carried more weight than words ever could. Her family gathered that evening, the house filling with quiet murmurs and the smell of coffee. One by one they handled the items, passing them around as though they were relics of a lost time. Emily's parents cried softly, her mother pressing the fleece to her lips as though it might still carry her daughter's scent. Claire's father studied Josh's watch, shaking his head at how the hands had frozen at midnight, the moment seeming to anchor itself into the family's memory. In the days that followed, plans for a memorial service began to take shape. After 12 years of waiting, there would finally be something tangible to mourn, a ceremony where names could be spoken not with uncertainty, but with remembrance. Friends who had long stopped asking questions reached out again, offering condolences and memories. For the first time, Claire did not have to explain the unknown. She had a story to tell, however painful, and it gave her a strange sense of strength. At night, when the house was quiet, she reread the photocopies of the journal entries the rangers had provided. Emily's voice lived in those lines, her determination, her humor, her awe of the wilderness, even as it turned against her. Claire underlined a sentence that stayed with her, "We'll keep going until we can't." It was not resignation, but resolve, and in it Claire recognized the sister she had always admired. Though the grief was sharp, it was no longer hollow. The years of silence had ended, replaced by a fragile truth she could carry forward. Emily and Josh had not simply vanished. They had left their story in the ash and earth of Yellowstone, and now, finally, that story could be told. The memorial was held on a crisp autumn morning, the mountains around their hometown dusted with the first hints of snow. Friends, family, and neighbors gathered at a small church where photographs of Emily and Josh lined the walls. Some showed them on their wedding day, Emily's turquoise scarf wrapped around her shoulders. Others captured the pair on countless hikes, their smiles bright and unguarded. For 12 years those photos had been symbols of absence, reminders of what was lost. Now they stood as a testament to lives lived fully, if far too briefly. Claire spoke at the podium, her voice steady, though her hands trembled as she clutched the journal in its protective binder. She read aloud the first entry, Emily's words about discovering a hidden clearing and the joy of finding a place untouched. The congregation listened in silence, the intimacy of the writing pulling her sister's spirit into the room. She was still herself, right until the end, Claire said softly. Even when the world grew dark around her, she chose to write about wonder. The service closed with a moment of silence, followed by the release of 2 lanterns that drifted into the pale morning sky. As the crowd watched them rise, the weight of years seemed to lift slightly, replaced with something gentler, the knowledge that Emily and Josh had finally been found. Later, at the reception hall, people shared stories. Friends recalled camping trips where Emily insisted on making pancakes over a camp stove, no matter the weather. Others spoke of Josh's meticulous planning, how he always carried extra maps and still managed to get lost with a grin. The laughter that mingled with tears gave the day a tone of remembrance rather than tragedy. That night, Claire sat alone with the box of belongings once more. She placed the hair clip on the dresser beside her bed and wound Josh's broken watch until its cracked hands shifted faintly, though they could not keep time. It felt symbolic. Time had not moved for them in 12 years, but for her it had, and now it was hers to carry forward. The grief was still raw, but it no longer carried the sting of uncertainty. The wilderness had given back what it had taken, and with it came the gift of closure. Claire whispered goodnight into the dark, knowing at last that her sister's story had an ending, and that ending could finally be laid to rest. Weeks after the memorial, Claire found herself returning again and again to the journal, unable to let go of the voice captured on those ash-stained pages. She kept it in a drawer by her bedside, pulling it out late at night when the house was quiet. Sometimes she read whole passages, sometimes just a single line, but each time she felt her sister's presence close, as if Emily were leaning over her shoulder, whispering the words herself. It was painful, but it was also healing. For so long, Emily had been defined by silence, by the unknown. Now her story existed in ink, and Claire could choose when to listen. The Rangers continued to keep her updated as they finalized their report. Paul Hansen called one evening, his voice calm but tinged with weariness, to let her know the case would soon be officially closed. The report would state that Emily and Josh had died as a result of a sudden geothermal event buried beneath ash and soil where their tent had been pitched. It was not negligence or recklessness, only tragedy. Claire thanked him, her voice breaking as she admitted she wasn't ready for the word closed. Paul paused, then told her something that stayed with her. "Closure doesn't mean forgetting," he said. "It means carrying them forward without the weight of doubt." That night, Claire dreamed of Yellowstone. She saw the open valleys and steaming vents, the endless sweep of pine and stone, and somewhere in the distance, her sister's laughter carried on the wind. She woke with tears in her eyes, but also with a sense of calm she hadn't felt in years. She decided then to visit the park one final time, not as the sister of someone missing, not as a mourner at the edge of a cordoned site, but as someone ready to walk the trails Emily had loved. She wanted to see the geysers, the rivers, and the ridges, to step where her sister had stepped, not with grief, but with reverence. The wilderness had taken Emily and Josh, but it had also preserved them, keeping their story sealed beneath its ash until the moment it was ready to be told. Now that the truth was uncovered, Claire knew she could walk forward, not with answers alone, but with the memory of their resilience etched forever into the land. Spring returned to Yellowstone the following year, softening the scorched edges left behind by the fires. Green shoots pushed through the ash, Wildflowers spread across the meadows, and the valleys began to look alive again. Nature had a way of healing itself, though it never erased what had happened beneath its soil. At the site where the Turner's tent had been unearthed, the earth still bore faint scars, but the silence there now carried a different weight. It was no longer only the silence of loss, but of remembrance. Claire came back in May, standing at the edge of the clearing where the rangers had once worked so carefully. She carried with her a small satchel of wildflower seeds, the kind Emily had loved to plant in pots outside her apartment windows. She knelt in the damp soil, scattering them gently across the ground where ash had once lain heavy, her fingers trembling as she pressed them in. It was a quiet gesture, but one that felt like giving something back to the land that had taken so much. Paul Hansen stood nearby, giving her space but watching with the quiet respect of someone who had seen too many stories in the wilderness end without resolution. When she finished, Claire rose slowly, brushing the dirt from her palms. "I want this place to bloom," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "So, when people pass through here, they see life, not just what was lost." As they walked back toward the trailhead, Claire felt the familiar ache in her chest, but it no longer hollowed her. The journal, the photographs, the fragments of clothing and gear, those were the evidence of an ending. But the seeds she left behind were something else. A continuation, a reminder that even in the shadow of tragedy, life could grow again. At the overlook, she paused and took in the vast sweep of Yellowstone, the valleys stretching endlessly beneath the wide sky. Emily and Josh had loved this place, and though it had claimed them, it had also held their story safe until it was ready to be uncovered. Claire let out a long breath, steady and sure. Their chapter in the wilderness had closed, but their memory would keep moving forward, carried by the land, the flowers, and the voices that would never be forgotten.